Farmer Boy. County Fair, Part 2. Driving home was exciting that day because there was so much to talk about. Royal had thrown a ring over one of the black and white striped canes, and he had it. Alice had spent a nickel for peppermint candy. She broke the striped stick in two, and each had a piece to suck slowly. It seemed strange to be at home only long enough to do the chores and sleep. Early next morning, they were driving away again. There were 2 more days of the fair. This morning, Almanzo and Father went quickly past the stock sheds to the display of vegetables and grains. Almanzo caught sight of the pumpkins at once. They shone out brightly, golden among all the duller things. And there was Almanzo's pumpkin, the largest of them all. "Don't be too sure of getting the prize, son," Father said. "It isn't size that counts as much as quality." Almanzo tried not to care too much about the prize. He went away from the pumpkins with Father, though he couldn't help looking back at his pumpkin now and then. He saw the fine potatoes, the beets, turnips, rutabagas, and onions. He fingered the brown plump kernels of wheat and the grooved pale oats, the Canada peas and navy beans and speckled beans. He looked at ears of white corn and yellow corn, and red and white and blue corn. Father pointed out how closely the kernels grew on the best ears, how they covered even the tip of the cob. People walked slowly up and down, looking. There were always some people looking at the pumpkins, and Almanzo wished they knew that his was the biggest pumpkin. After dinner, he hurried back to watch the judging. The crowds were larger now, and sometimes he had to leave Father and squirm between the people to see what the judges were doing. The 3 judges wore badges on their coats. They were solemn and talked together in low voices so that no one heard what they said. They weighed the grains in their hands and looked at them closely. They chewed a few grains of wheat and of oats to see how they tasted. They split open the peas and beans, and they shelled a few kernels of each ear of corn to make sure how long the kernels were. With their jackknives, they cut the onions in 2 and the potatoes. They cut very thin slices of the potatoes and held them up to the light. The best part of a potato is next to the skin, and you can see how thick the best part is if you hold a very thin slice to the light and look through it. The thickest crowd pressed around the table where the judges were and watched without saying anything. There wasn't a sound. When at last the tall, thin judge with the chin whiskers took a snip of red ribbon and a snip of blue ribbon out of his pocket. The red ribbon was second prize. The blue one was first prize. The judge put them on the vegetables that had won them, and the crowd breathed a long breath. Then all at once everybody talked. Almanzo saw that people who didn't get any prize and the person who got second prize all congratulated the winner. If his pumpkin didn't get a prize, he would have to do that. He didn't want to, but he guessed he must. At last the judges came to the pumpkins. Almanzo tried to look as if he didn't care much, but he felt hot all over. The judges had to wait till Mr. Paddock brought them a big, sharp butcher knife. The biggest judge took it and thrust it with all his might into a pumpkin. He bore down hard on the handle and cut a thick slice out. He held it up, and all the judges looked at the thick yellow flesh of the pumpkin. They looked at the thickness of the hard rind and at the little hollow where the seeds were. They cut tiny slices and tasted them. Then the big judge cut open another pumpkin. He had begun with the smallest. The crowd pressed tight against Almanzo. He had to open his mouth to get a breath. At last, the judge cut open Almanzo's big pumpkin. Almanzo felt dizzy. The inside of his pumpkin had a big hollow for seeds, but it was a big pumpkin. It had lots of seeds. Its flesh was a little paler than the other pumpkins. Almanzo didn't know whether that made any difference or not. The judges tasted it. He could not tell from their faces how it tasted. Then they talked together for a long time. He could not hear what they said. The tall, thin judge shook his head and tugged his whiskers. He cut a thin slice from the yellowest pumpkin and a thin slice from Almanzo's pumpkin and tasted them. He gave them to the big judge and he tasted them. The fat judge said something and they all smiled. Mr. Paddock leaned over the table and said, "Good afternoon, Wilder. You and the boys are taking in the sight, I see. Having a good time, Almanzo?" Almanzo could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Yes, sir." The tall judge had taken the red ribbon and the blue ribbon out of his pocket. The fat judge took hold of his sleeve, and all the judges put their heads together again. The tall judge turned around slowly. Slowly he took a pin from his lapel and stuck it through the blue ribbon. He was not very near Almanzo's big pumpkin. He was not near enough to reach it. He held out the blue ribbon above another pumpkin. He leaned and stretched out his arms slowly, and he thrust the pin into Almanzo's pumpkin. Father's hand clapped on Almanzo's shoulder. All at once Almanzo could breathe, and he was tingling all over. Mr. Paddock was shaking his hand. All the judges were smiling. Ever so many people said, "Well, well, Mr. Wilder, so your boys got first prize." Mr. Webb said, "That's a fine pumpkin, Almanzo. Don't know as I ever saw a finer." Mr. Paddock said, "I never saw a pumpkin that beat it for size. How'd you rate a big pumpkin, Almanzo?" Suddenly everything seemed big and very still. Almanzo felt cold and small and scared. He hadn't thought before that maybe it wasn't fair to get a prize for a milk-fed pumpkin. Maybe the prize was for raising pumpkins in the ordinary way. Maybe if he told, they'd take the prize away from him. They might think he had tried to cheat. He looked at Father, but Father's face didn't tell him what to do. I kept hoeing it, and," he said. Then he knew he was telling a lie. Father was hearing him tell a lie. He looked up at Mr. Paddock and said, "I raised it on milk. It's a milk-fed pumpkin. Is that all right?" "Yes, that's all right," Mr. Paddock answered. Father laughed. "There's tricks in all trades but ours, Paddock. And maybe a few tricks in farming and wagon making too, eh?" Then Almanzo knew how foolish he had been. Father knew all about the pumpkin, and Father wouldn't cheat. Afterward, he went walking with Father among the crowds. They saw the horses again, and the colt that won the prize was not so good as Starlight. Almanzo did hope that Father would bring Starlight to the fair next year. Then they watched the foot races and the jumping contests and the throwing contests. Malone boys were in them, but the farmer boys won. Almost every time, Almanzo kept remembering his prize pumpkin and feeling good. Driving home that night, they all felt good. Alice's woolwork had won first prize, and Eliza Jane had a red ribbon, Alice had a blue ribbon for jellies. Father said the Wilder family had done itself proud that day. There was another day of the fair, but it wasn't so much fun. Almanza was tired of having a good time. 3 days of it were too much. It didn't seem right to be dressed up again and leaving the farm. He felt unsettled as he did at house cleaning time. He was glad when the fair was over and everything could go on as usual. She broke the striped back and back stick. It's still recording.